certainly a lot more we could say about the war, the Revolutionary War, and the impact it made, and some other ideas, things like, was this a Christian just war, in the just war tradition? Is this just, since it goes against Romans chapter 13, right, where you're supposed to accept authority of government. 1 Peter chapter 2 that says honor the king. Was the Revolutionary War a just war in the Christian tradition? There's all sorts of things that we could go with that we just don't have time to talk about. But with the War of Independence, there's this introduction of a representative republic, not a true democracy, but a representative republic where the people have a voice in government. Well, something similar happened over in France as well. But while the American War of Independence allowed religion to flourish, the French Revolution often stood against religion. In the latter part of the 18th century, economic conditions deteriorated in France, which led to a lot of social tensions between the clergy and the nobility, between nobility and commoners, commoners and clergy. And throughout all of this, there were several times where the people of Paris rioted to show their opposition. During all this time, the National Constituent Assembly, which was essentially kind of the coming out of the French Parliament, issued a document called the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. Essentially, this idea was, or some of the things said out of this, was important emphasis placed on freedom, equal rights, including the idea that liberty, and this is a quote, liberty consists in the freedom to do everything which injures no one else. Hence, the exercise of the natural rights of each man has no limits except those which assure to the other members of the society the enjoyment of the same rights. Right? So you can do whatever you want as long as it doesn't injure somebody else or deprive them of their rights. No one shall be disquieted, again quoting, on account of his opinions, including his religious views, provided their manifestation does not disturb the public order established by law. Every citizen may accordingly speak, write, and print with freedom, but shall be responsible for such abuses of this freedom as shall be defined by law. Well, the French king refuses to accept this, and so the Paris populace riots again. Eventually, the civil constitution of the clergy is promulgated, also by the National Constituent Assembly. And if you remember back, we briefly mentioned at other times that France had received some freedoms from Rome that the Pope had not given in other countries, largely due to the need to rely on France and throughout the Avignon papacy. And so in the civil constitution, the National Constituent Assembly decides that the bishops need to be regulated. Quote, no church or parish of France nor any French citizen may acknowledge upon any occasion or upon any pretext whatsoever the authority of an ordinary bishop or of an archbishop whose see, the region they're under control of, that they're over of, shall be under the supremacy of a foreign power, which of course the Pope was, nor that of his representatives residing in France or elsewhere. But there is that exception for the visible head of the universal church. Beginning, to continue quoting, beginning with the day of publication of the present decree, there shall be but one mode of choosing bishops and parish priests, namely that of election. Right, so they're taking the right of the Pope, the archbishops, to appoint bishops in France and saying they're going to be elected. The people are going to decide. Paul VI condemns the document because it's essentially trying to cut his power and the power of the bishops. But Louis XVI, who was king at the time, finds out that he's condemned it, but he wants to keep that secret from the people, because if the people find out the Pope is condemned, there's going to be arrived. Ultimately, he agreed with the Assembly, the Civil Constitution, with the proviso that the Pope supported. All clergy were expected to agree to it or be removed. Eventually, war would erupt between France and parts of the Holy Roman Empire, Austria and Prussia especially. France was on the losing end. And so civil war develops in France. The monarchy is abolished, the king is convicted of treason and executed. Rebellion, revolution, and terror flower. Enemies of the revolution faced the guillotine and the so-called Reign of Terror. Many of the revolutionaries in this war were very anti-religious and believed themselves the epitome of thinkers of science and reason, but they still recognized the need for some sort of organization that would tie people together. And so the cult of reason was developed. Essentially, the civic response to an anti-religious outlook. The cult of reason would be a social organization that served the function of religion, but, those ideas of community, but attempting to avoid what they considered the superstitious aspect of religion, deities, supernatural revelation. Ultimately, the cult of reason, supposedly being reasonable, would lead to persecution, imprisonment, and death, as priests and nuns would refuse to swear before the altar of freedom, various altars to the goddess freedom. After the reign of terror had died down, ultimately out of all of this, Napoleon Bonaparte came to power. He attempted to reconcile France to the papacy, particularly after the death of Pius VI, who had been captured by the French. He would release the Concordat of 1801, which gave the church back some of its civil status. Catholicism would be noted as the religion of the majority of French people, but it was not the state religion any longer. The church would be allowed to remove bishops from power, but it was the French state that would nominate them. A couple quotations here. Before assuming their functions, the bishops will take directly at the hands of the first consul the oath of loyalty used before the change of government. First consul referred to Napoleon's position at the time. The oath of loyalty expressed in the following terms. I swear and promise before God, on the Holy Scriptures, to observe obedience and loyalty to the government established by the Constitution of the French Republic. I also promise to have no dealings, to attend no council, to converse with no group, whether within or without, which would be contrary to the public peace. And if, in my diocese or elsewhere, I learn that something is being plotted to the detriment of the state, I will make it known to the government. And so they're essentially making priests and bishops spies for the government, making them swear an oath of allegiance. A prayer, again quoting, a prayer in the following form will be repeated at the end of the divine office referring to the Mass and some other religious observances, will be repeated at the end of divine office in all Catholic churches in France. God save the Republic, God save the consuls. Eventually, Napoleon would maneuver his way into becoming emperor. Pius VII will come to his coronation. But just as he is preparing to put the crown on Napoleon's head, Napoleon will take the crown from him and put the crown on his own head instead of allowing the Pope to do it. Questions about any of the things that we've talked about with respect to politics? We turn now to some cultural and social developments. Again, a lot more that we could say here. But one of the major philosophical movements of the 18th century is often called the Enlightenment. It's a little deceptive by referring to the Enlightenment because there were actually enlightenments. And there were different ways people approached this notion of reason, and reason being an authority in philosophy. And so in one sense, to refer to it in the singular is misleading. But in a sense, there are some general strands that tie these enlightenments together. Ultimately, this is coming out of a lot of the scientific and philosophical developments of the 17th century, which emphasized empiricism, observation, knowledge coming through the senses, as well as a mechanistic view of the universe. Right? That the universe, the solar system, operated according to certain laws that were in place. Right? The Earth revolves around the sun at the same speed. That the stars and all those kind of things, all of that operates under certain laws of motion. Meaning that there was less of a concern to say there needs to be something supernatural to uphold all of this. The Enlightenment, of course, touched on things other than philosophy. It had consequences in criminal punishment, economics, politics, but it had, of course, consequences in religion as well, specifically for Christianity, but also for Judaism in Europe at the time. There were a couple of themes that come out of the Enlightenment that had some important bearing on Christianity. First was the idea that the universe is rational. And the best way to understand the universe and how the universe works is through the reason. Now, you might think, okay, I kind of agree with that. But what the Enlightenment thinkers were saying at the time was in contrast to revelation. Right? That we understand the universe best through what God has revealed in the Bible. And so they're saying the best way is to understand through the reason. Here we have things that are kind of culminating that have been developing since the scholasticism of the 12th and 13th centuries. Right? This emphasis on reason and religion. A second theme was the emphasis on truth coming through empirical observation. How do you know the truth about nature? How do you know the truth about human beings? Well, you observe. You take in information through your senses, through your eyes, through your ears, through the other senses as well. Also important for the idea of understanding was human experience. It is human experience that helps us understand, not some sort of authority that stands outside of human experience. A final theme was the importance of progress. History is about progress, moving forward. So, the present age is more enlightened than the past. But the Enlightenment thinkers, many of them, were not interested in getting rid of religion altogether. Some became irreligious, but many of them felt that there were aspects from these themes, from others, that they could develop that could still hold on to religion, believing that they had discovered these things through abstract reason, not through cultural teachings, what they grew up in, and what the church taught. One of the first beliefs that many Enlightenment thinkers had religiously was that there was a creator God. For many, that notion of design existing in the universe meant that there was a designer. And by the fact of the universe operating in mechanistic ways, suggested design to a lot of those Enlightenment thinkers. Many of them also believed in the afterlife, which might be a difficult one to say, how do you get to that from abstract reason, right? You're only doing reason. You're not appealing to a scripture. You're not appealing to some sort of revelation. Well, for many, it was based on, or at least they claimed, it was based on the cyclical aspects of nature, right? Nature is born, spring, you go through fall, winter, and then it's reborn in spring. So this notion that life begets life, death, new life, suggested that there was something afterward. Certainly that's a difficult one if you're only going by reason. The notion that something exists after death, it's hard to see that one compared to a creator God. Right? Reasonably, yes, it makes sense how you get to the notion of creator, but the afterlife, and many of them also believed in, those that held to an afterlife believed in rewards and punishments in that afterlife. A third common belief for many Enlightenment thinkers was in the moral teachings of Jesus. Many of them rejected Jesus' divinity. Jesus wasn't God in human form in the Enlightenment, but he was a good moral teacher. An extreme like this might be something we see with somebody like Thomas Jefferson, who took the New Testament and the Gospels and redacted out of the Gospels anything that smacked of the supernatural, leaving him only with the teachings of Jesus, believing that he was getting back to who Jesus really was, and then he would publish that as the life and philosophy of Jesus of Nazareth. So out go the miracles, out go the virgin birth, out goes the resurrection. The Enlightenment had consequences, of course, rejection of authorities, both religious and otherwise, an emphasis on toleration, and a turn to the natural world. One religious group kind of coming out of the Enlightenment was deism. Sometimes deists were also referred to as freethinkers. That was the one that they preferred. Other people referred to them as deists. Essentially, the deist view, if you really want to boil it down to something, was the belief in the clockmaker God. That God acted like a clockmaker who had built the universe, wound it up, stuck it on the mantle over the fireplace, and then backed away from it and let it run. God wasn't involved in the universe. He had created it, but wasn't actively involved. The universe was given over to natural processes. Many of the freethinkers, deists, were concerned with the amount of division that was present in religion by this time. Right? We're talking now a century and a half of religious division, religious wars between Catholics and Protestants, between Protestants. And so that was something they were concerned about. How do we bring unity to religion and cease this violence? Well, that unity would come, they thought, through reason, not appeals to revelation. Because they're looking at a situation and they're saying, well, all these people are appealing to the Bible, but they're claiming different interpretations. If we act reasonably, if we think through reason, we can all come to the same conclusion, it was thought. Furthermore, they believed that what was important within Christianity were the essentials. Find those things that are essential in religion. Everybody can agree on the essentials, and then everybody can just let everybody else go with things that were not essential. We're going to agree on the essentials, and then, if you want to hold some other belief, that's okay. But acting through the reason, we are not going to persecute people because of that. So what were those essentials? First was the belief that God existed and should be worshipped. Again, they believed that reason taught them that. But for the deists, worship was enacted when you lived a good life, when you were a moral person, when you were virtuous. That's what worship was.
Practice of virtue, true worship is considered an essential?
Yes.
Okay.
Right. So when they say worship, what they meant was living morally, right? Being a virtuous person. Another essential that they supported was the idea of the need for change. Right? If you're not virtuous, then you need to become virtuous. And then finally, a belief that there is a time coming where after life, you will either be rewarded or punished based on how you acted.